Welcome to the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. Do you dread hearing the question, what's for dinner? Whether you spend your days keeping up with toddlers, running kids to after-school activities, or juggling a career and family, getting dinner on the table can be a struggle for us all. I'm Mariefiebach, a business owner, wife, and mom of 4. I'm on a mission to build stronger families one dinner at a time, and I'm here with tips, tricks, and inspiration you need to feed your family tonight. Welcome to the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. Rachel, it is so fun to have you back. You are the first repeat guest. But for those of us who haven't heard episode 63 when you first came on, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Thriving Home and a little bit about your family and who you feed each night?
Sure. I'm excited to be back, Marie. I feel like we are very similar in our food philosophies, our family philosophies, our faith philosophies. So I'm really thankful to be here. I am half of Thriving Home. So my friend and I, Polly Connor, run it. And we started Thriving Home in 2012 as a way to encourage and resource moms at home. At that time, it was about a lot of things. We were writing about the things that we were learning in our own homes while raising little kids. And a lot of that was cooking, how to get meals on the table every night when it's stressful. And over time, over the years, we've kind of niched down into this space where we want to just really help moms thrive at home, one delicious meal at a time. And we do that through providing really smart kitchen strategies and easy real food recipes that just help moms save time, get healthy food on the table, help families come together around the table. Over the years, we've kind of become known as tongue-in-cheek freezer cooking evangelists. So, because we think that's like one of the best strategies for getting dinner on the table every single night. As far as my family, I'm married to Nathan. We actually will be married for 21 years next week. And we've got 3 kids. Our oldest is a 9th grader. He's in high school. Our middle kid is a girl. She's a 7th grader this year. And then our youngest is in 5th grade. So I've got 3 kids in 3 different schools this year.
Oh, Rachel, that's enough to make any mom get a little panicky. And I have lived that life. I have done it. I know the 3 kids in 3 schools. I'm actually right there with you right now with 3 different schools with my 4 kids. So I totally understand that. And yes, I love sending people to you when we talk about freezer cooking because I love freezer cooking, but I am more of a person who freezes kind of components of the meal, where you and Polly have this down to a science. You have your 1-hour freezer prep sessions where people can get a whole meal basically frozen and ready to go to cook. And I kind of wanted to talk about that today because you also said something that is really important is you talked about delicious meals because freezer meals sometimes have a reputation for being nothing but casseroles and not being delicious. And I know from the work that I've seen from you guys that you put out that that is not your philosophy on freezer cooking. So let's kind of talk about some ingredients today. Let's start with the things that you're like, they don't freeze really well. And then we'll get into some of the things that freeze well and the best ways to freeze them. So what are some things that you and Polly have found that really don't freeze great?
I love that question. I think it's really important. And I want to tell you right now, this is hard-earned wisdom from freezer cooking for like 15 years. I used to be in a freezer club with friends for 7 years, and we had no idea what we were doing when it came to freezing meals. And we learned pretty quickly the kinds of things that worked and didn't work. And so over the years, here's kind of what I've learned, and then through lots of research. So one thing is when you think about vegetables and fruit that have high water content, they don't freeze well and thaw well to just eat raw. So think cucumber, lettuce, like that's absolutely never going to work for the freezer. Fruits like cantaloupe or apples, things like that have high water content. Now there's some like onions and peppers and even celery that they do have a high water content, but you can freeze them and, but you don't want to probably thaw them and just eat them because the texture just kind of turns to mush. So for that kind of thing, what I like to do is slice them up or dice them up and flash freeze them. So you throw them on a sheet pan, stick them in the freezer until they're completely solid. and then throw them in a freezer bag or container. And then they're ready to use for things like stir fry, soups, anything where you're going to cook it and put it in a dish. One other vegetable too that I learned the hard way was potatoes. So potatoes actually, yeah, I mean, they will work in the freezer, but you have to know that they'll turn brown unless they're submerged in liquid, or if you've pre-cooked them, they won't turn brown. So like when I'm freezing a soup that has potatoes, I just absolutely make sure those potatoes are submerged in liquid.
I have made that mistake. I have walked down that aisle with potatoes, and yes, potatoes need to be in liquid, or even if they're refrigerated, if you're like peeling potatoes for something and you have them chopped up and you're going to be cooking them later in the day, they need to be in liquid or they will turn a not pretty color.
Yeah. Well, so they're still edible, but they're just ugly and gross and they don't look appetizing. So the second thing is dairy products. Now, this is not all dairy products, but a lot of them don't freeze and thaw well. So what I found over the years is things like soft cheeses, sour cream, cottage cheese, cream cheese, mayonnaise, not technically dairy, but kind of thrown in that category a lot of times. But they often, when you freeze them, they'll separate and the texture is just never the same again. That's not the case if you stir it into like a casserole or something like that, at least I've found. Now, milk, I've had people ask me over the years, like, can you freeze milk on its own? To be honest, when my kids were younger and we didn't get through a whole gallon of milk, and you're like looking at it in the fridge going, oh my gosh, that's so much money. I don't want to throw that away, but it's going to go bad tomorrow. I've thrown it in the freezer and it's, I wouldn't say it's the same texture wise or taste wise. Like it doesn't come out tasting like fresh milk, but it is safe to use in recipes. So I'll use it in like baking recipes and things like that.
Okay, can we stop for just a second? And I want to talk a little bit more about when you're freezing dairy and it's mixed with something. Is that something where you've got to have like a roux or some other kind of stabilizer? Or can you even mix it with more liquid things? I'm thinking something like a penne al vodka or something that has a little bit of heavy cream in it. Talk with me about what kinds of things you have to mix with the dairy to keep it stabilized.
Well, from my experience, I'm thinking about like the vodka sauce you're talking about. That would freeze just fine. We've frozen that many times. We tested that for our cookbook. It did fine. So I guess cooking it, blending it into something, tomato bisque. You know, I get people ask us this all the time. It's one of my favorite recipes on Thriving Home. And at the end, you add butter, you swirl in butter, and you add in half and half. I freeze that literally twice a month. I make a big batch, freeze it in small portions for my son's lunch because he loves it. He takes it to lunch. So I think blending it into something like that or stirring it into, lasagna that you prepared. We can get to this part, but I don't recommend like baking a casserole and then freezing it. I don't think that's the best way to do it, but getting it all prepared and then freezing it, it seems to do fine when it's tucked in there. It's just literally like I would never throw a container of cottage cheese in the freezer or ricotta cheese. It gets gross.
It does. It separates. I've had sour cream separate on me. And growing up, my mother would make a beef stroganoff and sometimes she'd throw the extra sour cream in the freezer. And the second time she used it, it just had a weird, grainy, curdled texture and it was just never the same. So I appreciate your knowledge and wisdom on this because it really makes a difference. And so many great things can be frozen, but it's a good thing to know what else doesn't freeze well. So is anything else on your list for things that are no-nos?
So obviously foods that can expand and explode in the freezer. So let me walk you through that. So like eggs and their shell, don't throw them in there. They're going to explode because when it freezes, it expands. Canned foods, don't ever throw a canned food. I don't know if that's probably a no duh thing, but who knows? Wine in a bottle, like don't ever throw that in there. So that's just a forewarning. Seafood in a marinade. This is one I've learned the hard way too. So, salmon or shrimp. I love those marinated, but really they only need to marinate for like 30 minutes at most. And so when you throw them in a marinade, throw them in the freezer, they're going to start to break down. And even if the marinade has acid in it, it'll also kind of start to pre-cook them. And so they just don't turn out very well. So I do not recommend that. And then the last one I had written down was just So leftovers. I don't think this is true of all leftovers, but some pre-cooked foods just don't do great in the freezer. So I'm thinking things like you've cooked a steak, you've got leftover steak. Lean meats, things that have been grilled and maybe cut up or whatever, you throw them in the freezer, they just come out. And when you try to rewarm them, they're just dry. I think the same is true when you've cooked pasta, especially if it's not al dente and you throw it in there by itself. It can really break down. It doesn't taste good to just eat on its own. Fried food, just leftovers like that just don't do great in the freezer.
Well, and there's kind of some basic science that happens with that. In the freezer, part of the things is that food dehydrates. It loses moisture, and that's what leads to freezer burn. And so if you've got something that is really delicate, like a piece of steak, losing moisture is going to make it dry. So the food science behind that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so now we kind of have gone through the things that you don't want to freeze. Let's talk about the best ways to freeze food so that it is still delicious. Something as smart as not marinating your seafood. Let's talk about some of those techniques that is going to help you have more delicious freezer food. So do you want to give us a couple of those, Rachel?
Yeah. And so feel free to chime in here because I know you do a lot of prep of individual ingredients while I'm thinking most of the time about prepping an entire, main dish or meal. So here's the things that we think of when we're freezing meals. One is, first of all, if you want it to taste good after it comes out the freezer, make sure you're using high quality ingredients at the front end. That's just, step one. Secondly, when you are done, if you end up cooking something, so say you cook a soup, make sure it is chilled completely before going in the freezer. And the reason why is a couple of reasons. One is it helps prevent that freezer burn that you mentioned. And two, you don't want to stick hot food in your freezer. It starts to warm up the freezer itself and can affect the foods around it. So that's really, really important. Now, one thing to know, I know you're big on food safety, which is great. I'm so glad. But when you're chilling foods, you can't just leave it out on the counter indefinitely until it's cooled off. So you can leave food out for up to 2 hours. That's what the USDA says is safe. After that, put it in the refrigerator. And so sometimes even to get it to cool down faster, you can separate, like if you have a hot soup or stew or something like that, separate it into small, shallow dishes, stick it in the fridge. And once it's cooled off, then you can freeze it.
Something that I do on that, even depending upon what it is I have been known to just throw a couple ice cubes in it. Like if it's a soup or something and a little bit of extra water isn't going to hurt it, I'll just throw a couple ice cubes in to kind of get it cooled down faster because you are so right. Frozen food that's going into the freezer needs to be at least room temperature, if not colder, before it goes in the freezer.
Yep. And so another really important thing, this is one thing that we probably get asked the most about, is what do you freeze your food in? So here's the biggest tip I can give you is air is the enemy of good freezer food. So the more you can wrap up your food tightly and prevent that air exposure, the better. So when in doubt, I would say wrap it up in plastic wrap or foil. Make sure you have some, if you want to use freezer containers, buy good ones that have a lid that's, airtight, that kind of thing.
And finding ones that have airtight lids is hard, especially when you're looking at the 8x8 size and the 9x13 size. I have found that can be really hard. One of my little tricks for those is that I will put a piece of plastic wrap under the lid and have it touch the surface of the food, because then again, if you have some of that evaporation, some of that water loss that happens, it's going to stay closer to the food and it helps keep the freezer burn away. Have you ever done that with the plastic wrap over food?
Are you reading my mind? I literally was going to say that. I do that too. Yes, I totally agree. And I think that's an example of what I mean is when in doubt, just make sure you cover it. So great tip. You can also use, the other thing you can use is mason jars. Now, I know people are afraid what if it expands? What if it cracks in the freezer? If you're using real mason jars, I'm not talking like a pickle jar or something, that's a different grade of glass. But real mason jars are intended to be used in the freezer as well. But you always have to leave at least 1 inch of headspace at the top for expansion. those work well for things like soups and like you could freeze a marinade on its own, not with meat in it. You could freeze a sauce like marinara sauce and that kind of thing. And they're nice to have for individual servings if you're going to make for someone else.
Especially like your kid with the tomato bisque soup. Do you ever freeze those in little mason jars?
Well, actually for him, what I do is I've found these 2-cup Pyrex containers. They go in the freezer, but they're also microwave safe. And so what we do is, like on the weekends, I make a big batch. He helps me get it into the little Pyrex containers. And then we put those in the freezer, and throughout the week, he'll pull one out and he'll defrost it in the microwave in the morning and throw it in a thermos.
Yeah, I love that. My kids eat a lot of food from the thermoses too. And containers that you can go from either the refrigerator or the freezer straight into the microwave, just save dishes in the morning.
Totally. Yes.
I'm all about keeping life easy. Okay. So what other tips do you have, Rachel?
The other big thing is when you go, so you've got it all wrapped up, right? You've chilled it. You've got it in your freezer container. Now you want to freeze it in the coldest spot of the freezer. And just so you know, the freezer needs to always be at a constant 0 degrees. Now I know 32 degrees, it means it's, below freezing temperature, but you want to keep it at 0 because think about, you are opening and closing that freezer throughout the week, and that lets out a lot of the air, the cold air. So that's what the USDA recommends. Put it in the coldest spot because you want it to freeze quickly. Because like you were talking about, there's this evaporation that happens. To avoid that, make sure it freezes really fast.
Okay. Where's the coldest spot in your freezer?
Okay. So it'd be in the very back and in the center.
Okay.
Just like the most insulated spot. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good question. It's a good question. A lot of people ask us, well, how long can something stay frozen at that point? Okay. So it kind of depends on the food, but most of our freezer meals, if they're packaged correctly, they've been frozen correctly, they easily last 3 months in a normal freezer. If you have a deep freezer, because you're not opening and closing it as much, there's a little bit more insulation. You can keep it really cold. I've had meals stay good for 6 to 9 months easily. And here's the one thing that really shocks people a lot of times is that freezer food, as long as it stayed frozen and, stayed completely frozen, it is safe indefinitely to eat, which is crazy. Like
it might not taste as good. The flavor does start to degrade, right?
Right. So but texture, flavor will start to diminish. That's what we're talking about. How long can it stay? But my point is, it's still safe. And so I've always been like, don't throw a meal out until you try it,
For sure. For sure. You've worked too hard to throw it away. Although I do have some memories of eating turkey from last year's Thanksgiving in like September and August and having that freezer burn taste. That's just one of my memories as a child, is that my mother would make this and she would call it turkey treat. And it had gotten too much air to it. And she served it with biscuits. So she kind of bribed us with the bread.
Yeah.
She bribed us with the carbs, but it wasn't airtight and it had been in there way too long. And but it was safe to eat. We didn't get sick from eating it, but the flavor and the texture had started to degrade. So that's a really big point difference to know, is that it's safe. The flavor and the texture can start to degrade.
Yeah, I'm glad that didn't ruin you on freezer food. And I'm also really impressed that your mom came up with the name turkey treat. Like here, hey guys, turkey treat, here we go.
Right? Oh my gosh. My mother was a genius with the freezer meals. Like she had it down to a science, and she liked to do, I learned, she did it a lot of similar the way that I do it, is she would freeze things in concentrate. So if she made a spaghetti sauce, she would make it without 2 or 3 cans of the sauce. And then she would add the cans later so that she had the base and the flavor kind of in concentrate, but it wasn't taking as much room in her freezer. Now, do you have some tips on not taking up too much room in your freezer?
Ooh, that's a good idea. Well, we really like the gallon size freezer bags, the BPA freezer bags. And that's kind of what we use. If you aren't into plastic, you're trying to reduce plastic, I totally get it. I applaud you. We have tried the silicone bags. They're, in my opinion, and maybe you have a different opinion, Marie, I'd be interested to know, they're hard to wash. They can get stained. They just don't work and stack as easily. But what I love about the bags is that, like, if you put a soup in there or a marinated meat, you can freeze them flat on a baking sheet and then stack them, and they take very little room in the freezer. That would be my number one tip.
Well, and that is a big thing that you and I see eye to eye on that is whatever shape that bag goes in the freezer is the shape that it's coming out of. And you need to think about how you're thawing it, what you're doing with it. Because if you have something that's frozen flat square in those zip freezer bags and you're wanting to thaw it without putting it in the refrigerator, you're like wanting to thaw it on the stove or thaw it in the microwave, it doesn't fit in the bowl and it doesn't fit in the thing. So you have to think about how are you thawing it and what shape does it need to be? I know when you were on last time, you recommend Instant Pot meals putting in the Instant Pot liner so that it was in the shape of the Instant Pot. Like you can put the zip bag inside the Instant Pot liner, and then when you take it out, it's going to be in the right shape to put straight into the Instant Pot from frozen. I'm not a big fan of the silicone bags either. I know.
I keep hoping someone, like someday, it's kind of my heart dream is to somehow develop my own silicone freezer bags that actually work. But there's probably a reason why everyone's tried. And I don't know, maybe I'm missing something here. So I hope one of your readers chimes in and teaches us, like, what is the best silicone bag? Someone tell us, please.
Yeah, and you know what? I am not above reusing a gallon plastic bag. I'll wash them and reuse them depending upon what's been inside them. So I don't throw them all away, but they're just so handy. And I love that I can get the bags in different sizes so I can have a meal size portion for my family, or I can have a single portion for one of my kids to pull out for a lunch. They just work well in my house.
Yeah. So. But I've also invested in a lot of the 8x8 inch casserole dishes that have lids. Anchor Hawking makes them. And unfortunately, I think they've discontinued them. That's what we recommended for years. I just really like them. They have a see-through lid. They're really cute. They stack really nicely. They get just the right portion for a 4 to 6 person meal in there. So if you can find those, I actually in 2022, one of our goals is we're going to try to collect a whole bunch of freezer cooking storage. I don't know what you call it, like that different kinds of bags and different kinds of containers, and sort of do like a test what we think are the best ones. Cause we're kind of at this place where the ones we used to recommend don't work or aren't out there anymore as easily. So stay tuned. Maybe I'll be back to share that.
Rachel, I will have you back, because I tell you what, finding quality containers is so worth the investment. I have found that my life is so much easier when I have a lid that fits well, that doesn't crack in the freezer, because a lot of the plastic type lids crack after they've been washed over and over again. So I am all about finding those. So I will be watching your blog and I will alert my listeners, because I'd love someone to test that for me so I don't have to.
I know, right? Yeah.
Okay. So anything else for space saving? And using your refrigerator freezer versus a deep freezer, do you find that there are differences? Tell me a little bit about that.
Honestly, at this point, I've owned 2 different deep freezes, and I now currently don't use my deep freeze because I have 2. We need an extra refrigerator because we just have a ton. I have a teenage boy. We just have to go through so much milk and, just perishables like that. So I just use my regular freezer in both of those, and that does it for our family. And I stack those meals, like I said, with my 8x8s mostly, sometimes my freezer bags. But I use every square inch I can in those freezers and keep them packed. What are your tips? What do? You do a lot of freezer prep.
Well, I like to have meal size portions. That's my big thing is I don't want to have a giant thing that I'm going to have to chisel off a piece of it. I use freezer bags. And again, my big thing is whatever shape it goes in the freezer, that's the shape it's coming out. And so I want to think about my end game. A lot of times I'm doing like taco meat or hamburger and onions that I use for cheeseburger baked potatoes. And those are coming straight from my freezer into the microwave because that is a safe way to thaw it. And let's hit on thawing safety next. But that's a safe way to thaw it. And I want to make sure that it is in a shape where the little pieces of the plastic aren't getting into the nooks and crannies of the food. So I almost always put it on a baking sheet, freeze it until it's solid in a flat shape so that then I can just kind of stack it nicely in my freezer. So let's talk about thawing safety, because so many people want to take that out of the freezer and put it in their sink and come home at 5 o'clock at night and cook dinner. What are your thoughts on that technique, Rachel?
No, and no, because I don't want people to get sick. Food, this is really important. So you cannot set things out on your counter all day and let them thaw. I mean, that's just clear food science right there. Is bacteria will proliferate in your food if you do that. So, but the good news is there are several ways to thaw your food, and it doesn't have to take 2 days. Now, I'm a big fan of, we're talking about delicious freezer meals. I'm a big fan of the slow method of thawing. I think that's the best method. When you have a freezer meal that you've worked hard on, if you can think ahead, write it in your calendar. Like tonight, throw my freezer meal in the refrigerator and let it start thawing. You want to thaw a meal for 24 to 48 hours in your refrigerator before you're ready to cook. Okay, but let's say you didn't have a chance to do that. Then you've got a few other methods. One of those is the cold water method. I use it all the time. In fact, I'm using it right now. Tonight, I'm making some spaghetti sauce. I needed some ground beef. The ground beef is frozen and it's, whatever little 1 pound block. Throw it in some cold water in the sink, if your sink's clean, or a bowl, and change out the water every 30 minutes until it's thawed. And amazingly, it quickly thaws that way, especially the smaller the packages. So I use that all the time. Now, the thing is that you've got to make sure your freezer meal is very sealed if you're going to do that. And so it doesn't work for everything. Like a casserole in an 8x8 is not going to work with the cold water method. So then what do? Well, there is the microwave, and you can use the defrost button. We've all done it. I've done it many, many times. There's some things to know with that. It's probably going to partially cook your food a little bit around the outside, because just in order for it to get into the center and really defrost it, it'll start to cook the outside of it. So it can affect, the outcome of your food a little bit. But honestly, I don't think it's like the end of the world if you have to do that.
I mean, it depends upon what you're doing, but sometimes you're like, you do what you got to do. And now what about straight from the freezer to the oven? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. So I just did this the other night. What was I cooking? I took my leftover turkey. I think you were doing stuff with your leftover turkey too. Took my leftover turkey and made a 4-layer casserole. So it was just real simple. My kids like it. It's like shredded turkey, cheese, cream of chicken soup, and then the leftover stuffing on top. Okay. I had frozen that and I ran out of time. It was like halfway through the day. I hadn't thawed it. And so I covered it in foil, stuck it in my oven. And the recipe says it only takes, I want to say 20-ish minutes at 350 if it's thawed. But it took about an hour or so from frozen. Now, here is a great tip I learned from America's Test Kitchen. I love this tip. Is I took out my frozen glass casserole dish. Marie, pop quiz. Do you put frozen glass in a very hot oven? What do you think could happen?
Bad idea. That glass can rupture and then you don't have dinner and you have a giant mess to clean up. Ask me how I know.
Right. Oh, have you done that in the oven? Because I've done it on the stovetop before by accident, but
I have had a beautiful Port Merion lasagna dish crack in the oven.
Ouch.
So, yes. Yep.
That's so sad. So sad. So here's America's Test Kitchen's tip for that is stick your cold casserole in a cold oven, turn on the preheat. And as it preheats, it just slowly brings that glass up to a temperature that is safe for it to then bake. So that would be my tip. I know, mind blown, right?
Brilliant. Rachel, that is brilliant. That is a brilliant tip because you're right. Then the glass slowly comes up to temperature and you don't have to worry about it cracking or exploding or losing any of your food. That's a great tip.
Yep. So real quick, let me just share this story because I don't want somebody else to make this mistake. I was really busy. When my kids were little, I had toddlers at my feet. I was cooking some casserole or something, took it out of the oven because it was done and didn't realize one of the burners was on top of my stove, stuck it on top of a hot burner. And within a minute or two, it exploded. And there was one of my toddlers was nearby, and glass shards went flying in my kitchen. It was so scary. Thankfully, nobody got hurt, but it was, oh my gosh. I was like, I didn't even know what had happened. It sounded like a bomb went off.
Oh, so you want to make sure that if you're setting it on your stove, that the burners are off.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Right.
That is an excellent tip. Okay. Now we're going to get into one of the things that you and Polly are amazing at, and that is getting freezer prep done in a short amount of time. So you have these 1 hour freezer prep sessions where you make double batches of 3 different meals, and you have everything all laid out in an hour so that you can do it all. How did you guys come up with this idea? And tell me about some of your best tips if someone's trying to do a 1 hour freezer prep session.
Sure. So like I said, our heartbeat is really to help moms get a stress-free, enjoyable, delicious, healthy meal on the table. And over the years, we've realized that really freezer cooking has done that in our own homes. And we've seen it happen in lots of families' homes. But what people kept asking us for was like, hey, could you help us figure out how to do a lot of freezer meals in a short amount of time? And in fact, so we've published 2 cookbooks. Our first cookbook was kind of best of the best of all kinds of freezer meals. It's called From Freezer to Table. And we taught the basics of freezer cooking. We taught how to do it in community with friends in a freezer club. Our second cookbook was about slow cooker and instant pot freezer meals. But we had this third cookbook idea. And it was in our head. We were thinking, what if you could do 1 hour of freezer prep a week on your own for your family? So this idea kept coming up in our heads, and our readers loved the idea. We ran it past a bunch of people. And then we thought, why are we going to publish that? We should create it and sell it directly to people using what we are calling prep sessions. So that's what we've done. It's called 1 hour freezer prep. And within each prep session, we give you everything you need to put together 6 of these meals. So you get your shopping list, your equipment list, a menu plan, like telling you what sides to make with it, ways to mix it up. Since you're coming up with 2 of each of those meals, maybe you want to serve it differently the second time. So we give ideas for that. You have freezer labels. We have video tutorials. So that's the gist of the product.
You know, I have gone through and I've looked at your freezer prep sessions. And one thing that I really appreciate is that you and Polly are honest. There was one recipe where you said you need 4 tablespoons of chopped garlic. And if you buy the pre-chopped garlic, you can do this in an hour. But if you're peeling your own fresh garlic, it might take you a little bit longer than an hour. These are not meals that you guys have not tested. You have tested these in your home and other people's homes. Tell me a little bit about how rigorous you are before you put a meal in a meal prep session.
Well, it's interesting that you should interview me this week because I'm doing what's called 1 hour freezer prep boot camp all of December. So Polly is running the blog for a month while I am like head down and in all of this. So I am retesting even old recipes, developing some new recipes. And now once the recipes are all tested, developed, we make sure all of them are about 4 to 6 servings, which also sometimes takes some retesting and finagling of ingredients. Then I go to work of putting them together. So I write the prep session, and in my head, it might make sense, but then I got to go test it. So like I just went to the store today, bought all the ingredients. I'm going to test one of the prep sessions tomorrow. Then I make notes, then I tweak it. I might even test it again. And then finally, we send it out to a testing team. And so we have a pretty large testing team of really great moms who are just, like regular people who try this out in their own homes and tell us their feedback and what works and what doesn't. And then we make lots of changes from there. And then we test it again. So it's very rigorous testing.
That's what I love is that when you get these freezer prep sessions, you know that they should work in your home because they've been tested in lots of different homes and you put so much time and effort and thought. The other thing that I really like, because I face this in my home, is that you have gluten-free and dairy-free substitutions for almost everything in there. I know you personally eat gluten-free and dairy-free most of the time. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And so it was important to us. Yeah, people were asking for that, but it's easy for me to think that way already because that's how I eat.
Well, and there's so many simple substitutions that you can make, and there's so many easy to find dairy-free and gluten-free substitutions. So that makes it a little bit easier. But I love that you've thought about that, because I think that there's a lot of people that are dealing with, one person in their family has some allergies, and how can we feed the whole family one dish that everyone can eat without having to make 2 or 3 different meals? And I find that your recipes are really adaptable and adjustable for that. Rachel, I am so glad you came and talked about freezer cooking. I know that our listeners are going to appreciate this. If they are interested in finding out more about Thriving Home, where do they find you at?
Sure. We'd love for them to check us out at thrivinghome.org. They can join our email list if they just want to get a once-a-week email that gives the best of the best content on our site. They can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. And Marie, I think you're in our private Facebook group. We have a private Facebook group called Freezer Foodies. That's a really great community, supportive community. And people are always talking about the things we talked about today and asking questions. So I hope to meet some of your people.
Oh, it is a lovely Facebook group. So hop over and join the Freezer Foodies Facebook group, because it is lovely. And friends, Rachel and Polly have a discount code from me. If you are interested in looking at some of their 1-hour freezer prep sessions, go to thrivinghome.org and use the code Marie20. I'm going to link to their shop in the show notes. You can click on that link and you can use the discount Marie20 if you're ever interested. But know that freezer meals don't have to be complicated. And if you know a few of the basic tricks that Rachel taught you today, they can be delicious and they don't all have to be casseroles. And that's one of my favorite things about Rachel as well. So Rachel, thanks so much for coming on. We will maybe have you back on a third time. I just love that you joined us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Marie. I really appreciate all you do as well. So have a great day.
Thanks. All right, friends. Hope you're doing well. Take care.